slide one looks great. No one else gets to see slide one. So, welcome everyone. Welcome this afternoon. My name is Simona Golden and I direct the Teaching Works streaming seminar series. It's really my great pleasure to welcome you all today to the second streaming seminar series talk of the 2017-2018 academic year, focused on the theme Outrage to Action, Disrupting Inequity Through Teacher Education. The theme or investigation that we're working on together this year is really of the utmost urgency. We seek to articulate together how we as teacher educators work with our candidates to ensure that they are equipped not only to enact equitable practice, but also to disrupt patterns of inequity in our classrooms. Sonia Nieto, who is our first speaker, spoke clearly to this theme. I don't know what that was. She said, "We are dealing with culturally deprived schools. Our work is not to repair deficient children," she argued, "but to alter and to transform the atmosphere and the operations to which we commit these children." She elaborated on our theme and our press to articulate the work of teacher education as a lever for social justice. And she said, "Teaching pre-service and practicing teachers is not a task to be taken lightly, because it is about preparing the next generation of teachers, those who will have an impact on the future of young people in our society." It is in response to these convictions and our very real awareness of the high stakes of the work that we designed this seminar to be a curriculum for our own learning, with and from scholars and practitioners that we invite. We've asked our presenters this year to bring their considerable expertise to bear on this year's theme by selecting one high-leverage practice from the Teaching Works list, and then to investigate and illuminate the enactment of that practice, to expose the ways in which issues of equity and inclusion are really fundamental to just teaching. With concrete examples, our presenters help us to understand the detailed ways in which teaching and teacher education can be disruptive. We've already begun to accumulate some concrete examples of what our candidates can and must learn and what we can and must teach them. For example, in her talk on becoming sociocultural mediators, Sonia Nieto helped us to understand in some pretty fantastically nuanced ways what culture is and also what it is not. She made the point that missing in many discussions of culture are issues of power and issues of justice. And she entreated us to teach our candidates many things, including the following: to learn to say their students' names correctly, to label classrooms with all of the languages that are spoken by their students, to have books and other materials that reflect the backgrounds of students in the room and also of all the people in the world, and to learn as much as they can about their students as they engage in what she called authentic family research and outreach. Nieto has paved the way for us to welcome Dr. Valerie Kinloch here today. In her talk entitled Necessary Disruptions, Examining Justice, Engagement, and Humanizing Approaches to Teaching and Teacher Education, she will focus on the high-leverage practice explaining and modeling content, practices, and strategies. Today, Dr. Kinloch will help us to better understand this practice itself, and also, importantly, how we can ensure that each of our candidates is prepared to enact the practice responsibly with the children that they teach, so that they can locate students at the center of classrooms through, as Dr. Kinloch has written, asset-based, humanizing perspectives that lead to pluralism. In so doing, Dr. Kinloch will sketch the ways in which this practice can be salient and powerful for disrupting persistent patterns of inequality that exclude and disenfranchise children inside of schools and inside of their classrooms. So after that introduction, I want to just welcome all of you to keep track of the questions and comments and ideas that you have as we go along the way. I know that Dr. Kinloch has moments at which she'll invite you to speak, but we're also going to safeguard a considerable amount of time for the end of her talk for question and answer. So keep track of those things, don't lose them. For those of you who are joining us online, you can email your questions to one of three places, or all of them, to twseminar@umich.edu. You can use our Twitter hashtag @TWSeminar, or you could post to the Teaching Works Facebook page, and we'll relay your question to Dr. Kinloch at the end. And now I'd like to invite my colleague and friend, Amber Willis, who will introduce our speaker.
Good afternoon, everyone. Valerie Kinloch is the Renee and Richard Goldman Dean of the School of Education and professor at the University of Pittsburgh. Her scholarship examines the literacy of youth and adults inside and outside schools, particularly in urban environments. Author of publications on race, place, literacy, and equity, her books include Still Seeking an Attitude, Critical Reflections on the Work of June Jordan, Her Life and Letters, Harlem on Our Minds, Place, Race, and Literacies of Urban Youth, Urban Literacies, Critical Perspectives on Language, Learning, and Community, Crossing Boundaries, Teaching and Learning with Urban Youth, and Service Learning and Literacy Education, Possibilities for Teaching and Learning. In 2012, her book, Harlem on Our Minds, received the Outstanding Book of the Year award from the American Educational Research Association. And in 2014, her book titled Crossing Boundaries, Teaching and Learning with Urban Youth was a staff pick for the professional development by the Teaching Tolerance Education magazine. Additionally, Dr. Kinloch is the recipient of the 2015 Reway Bell Inglis Award for Outstanding Women in English Education from the National Council of Teachers of English, and the 2010 Scholars of Color Early Career Award for American Education Research Association. She has received grants from the Spencer Foundation, National Council of Teachers of English, Corporation of National and Community Service, and the Battelle Endowment for Technology, With colleagues, she participated in a Fulbright Hays project to Sierra Leone, West Africa, to examine connections among language, culture, and history in Sierra Leone and the U.S. Gullah Sea Islands. Currently, she is completing book projects and community initiatives on literacy, justice, race, and engagement. Please join me in welcoming Dean Kinloch.
So it is a pleasure to be here with you and to share aspects of my work with you. So I'm Valerie Kinloch from the University of Pittsburgh, where I am currently the Renee and Richard Goldman Dean of the School of Education. And what I'd like to do today is to engage in conversations with you in reference to the topic, which is about disruptions. It's about disruptions, it's about interruptions, it is about the ways in which we think about equity, justice, and humanization, particularly in teaching and teacher education. And what I'd like to do is to not just talk with you or to you, but to engage in conversations. And so there will be moments where I'm asking you to think with me about what you see, about a moment that's happening in the world, and then eventually about a moment that's happening inside of classrooms with students. And so the title, Necessary Disruptions, is truly meant to not just be a title for a talk, but a title for what we're going to do here today. It's all about disruptions. And at times it might seem as if I'm going sort of on left field or right field or to the top or to the bottom, and it might not all make sense. But I think at the very end, all of these disruptions will come together and we can actually talk about what it means to engage in disruptions when we talk about teaching and teacher education. So I want to start there. I want to draw our attention to the high leverage practice that I've been invited to talk about today. And that high leverage practice is on explaining and modeling content, practices, and strategies. And as I think about that practice, I think about the ways in which we should make content, academic practices, our strategies, basically what we're asking people to do inside of classrooms, explicit and clear, understandable, and also doable. And when I say doable, are we able to do what we're asking our students to do if we need to? And how do we make that really clear and explicit to ourselves, to our colleagues, and also with our students? When I think about this practice, I also think about the ways in which we should model and explain and demonstrate, and listen, observe, think aloud, observe again, think aloud, ask questions with students. And it's not just to ask questions for clarification, but it's to ask questions for a deeper meaning, to understand what people are thinking when we actually talk about how we think about content and practices and strategies. And so throughout my time with you, I'm going to be talking about this high leverage practice, but my side note or footnote or end note is that it might not appear that I'm doing that. And that's purposeful and intentional. So I want to actually start by turning to the world as opposed to what's going on in classrooms, as opposed to directly talking about what's happening inside of our teaching and teacher education programs. I want to think about the world. And I want you to help me think about the world as well. So what about the world? What is going on today in the world? And how do we make sense of what is going on in the world today when we think about these various images? Does anyone recognize this image? Or does anyone recognize what's going on in this image that might happen everywhere, given the current landscape of public education in the United States? Anyone? Yes. Yes. So this image comes from Ithaca College in upstate New York. And it was at Ithaca College where students decided to protest how their administration handled racial incidences on campus. And so in response, the dean of Ithaca College announced that he would hire a new chief diversity officer. And I think that's wonderful. But I also think that hiring one person to help us think through large issues that impact all of us is not enough. And so how do we remain committed to engaging in this work collaboratively and collectively with each other? Does anyone recognize this image? No. Okay. Yes, that is here at the University of Michigan. And as other college campuses across the United States, your campus has also experienced a lot of unrest. A lot of unrest after a lot of racist incidents and actions on campus this particular school year, including, from my understanding, racist flyers, anti-Latinx and pro-Trump graffiti on campus landmarks, and among other things, racial slurs written on the doors of our various dormitories. And so this also happens, and it's happening here, but it's also happening at other universities and on other college campuses. This is from another university, Missouri, and students were protesting a group, and they decided to lock arms. And they decided, you know, enough is enough. What we need is not just activism on campus, but we need justice. What we need is not just inclusion, but what we also need is fairness and equity. And how do we actually get these things on college campuses in ways where our voices are heard? And we can actually band together, stand with each other, and say, enough is enough. I start with these images and so many more that I will show you because in order for me to talk about what happens in classrooms and what we need to do when we think about teaching and teacher education, I must take a step back and I must think about what is happening in our larger world. This happened at Miami University. 2 freshmen suspended for writing racist and hateful messages on whiteboards. Racial slurs written on residence hall bulletin boards at Miami University in Ohio. And they continue, and they continue, whether we're talking about on college campuses, near college campuses, or in our various communities. Do we recognize the images here? Yes, Charlottesville. And I quote the University of Virginia's president, who said, "I am deeply saddened and disturbed by the hateful behavior displayed by torch-bearing protesters who marched on our grounds this evening. I strongly condemn the unprovoked assault on members of our community, including university personnel who were attempting to maintain order. The violence displayed on the grounds is intolerable and is inconsistent with the university's values. How do we make sense of this? How do we make sense of the reality that in 2017, we are continuing to experience not just unrest and not just protests, justifiably so, on our campuses and in our societies, but we are experiencing unjust actions by people across the world, particularly in the United States. And for me, that gives me pause. I need to ask questions about equity. I have to ask questions about justice, and I have to ask questions about humanization. And I do those things through the lens of teaching and teacher education. And yet, that's not enough. You know, I can show image after image after image of people who send the message that I am really sick and tired of unjust behaviors and actions. And so here, we have a situation where about 350 students decided to march at Boston College to protest their administration's non-response to an anti-LGBTQI slur on campus. We have all of these incidences, and I'd be remiss if I don't also say we all have incidences involving people like Freddie Gray or Eric Garner, the young people like 18-year-old Tyler Clemente, who jumped to his death after being bullied for being gay. We have 1 in every 2 Muslim Americans who have reported being religiously and or racially persecuted in this last year alone. We also have those who are raped and sexually assaulted on our college campuses, but are not fully protected even after reporting rape and those sexual incidences. They all deserve that we place attention on the injustices and the oppressions that are happening in the world, and that we ask without question questions that need to be asked, that need to have answers. And when I think about the realities happening at universities in particular, before I even get to secondary education, which is where I'm going, just to let you know, I think about what it means to be a student in 2017 on our various college campuses. And then with a group of young people, high school students, I talked about this video. I shared this particular video with them, and I said, so first of all, I want you to tell me what you see. I want you to tell me what you think. And I also want you to tell me how you feel when you see this video. And I'm asking you to do the same thing. This is a video, and it's titled Black on Campus.
I am a biochemistry major. My first day of biochemistry class, a girl is speaking with me. She ends up telling me, oh wow, in the city where I'm from, we have so few black people. The police batons are actually called nigger knockers. Wow. And I'm like, all right, this is a precedent for how my Purdue experience is gonna go.
Racism has got to go, hey, hey! Oh, oh! Racism has got to go, hey, hey! Oh, oh! No racism! No racism!
This bus stop right here, I've been called a nigga at least once or twice. I'm a student in chemical engineering here on a scholarship, but yet everybody asks me what position I play or what's my 400-meter time.
It's bigger than just the black student population here. There's a whole group on Yik Yak that actually just dedicated to talking and saying terrible things about the Asian population here.
Our students are on Yik Yak telling us they're going to throw cotton balls at us.
Take a phoenix of hope and tell them I belong here. Take the fist from your stomach and raise it in the air until it separates the sky and the rays of...
We're out here to make a stand about the injustices we've been experiencing. Mizzou kind of inspired us and reminded us of our power, but it's bigger than Mizzou. It's every black student on a campus across this country experiences a lot of individual microaggressions. Just any form of racism is on campus. Any of the hashtags you see, hashtag Black on Campus, and tweet what your experience has been. Let the world know that Purdue is not as nice as it looked in the brochure.
Hey, let's break the damn internet!
Some of the tweets that went rather viral. Hashtag Bulls of Purdue, quote, I wish you would stop blaming white people for everything. Racism has been over for years. Hashtag Bulls of Purdue. What does your father do? Or is he not around? Hashtag Bulls of Purdue. Why can't we have a white cultural center?
Mitch Daniels released a letter. Our university president said that our community culture is a non-discriminatory one, and we respect everybody's right to free speech. And we're not like Mizzou and Yale, we're not like any other university. But if you were actually to listen to the students, we're not even talking about free speech. We're talking about how other students use their free speech to make us uncomfortable.
I am the only opposition here. You cannot control what people are saying if it's offensive. Be offended. It's okay. Nothing happens if you are offended.
Shut up. You go to college for free.
They have Free Zone, and it's where we talk about how everyone's different essentially. You have to accept people for their differences, and the hashtag is Free Zone because everyone's free to be themselves. Well, it's kind of a joke. At the end of it, all the freshmen, we came out and we were like, oh, haha, like Free Zone. It's a free zone, guys. I can say what I want. But that's still hurtful sometimes.
We got the power. What kind of power? Student power.
We have free speech and you can say whatever you'd like to say on this campus. What's behind the new policy is to really make sure that we are able to have intellectual exchange, and that's what we want at an institution of higher education. But at the same time, we want our students to feel safe and comfortable and to be able to have that educational experience. And I think right now we're trying to figure out how to have both of those things.
So that is on college campuses. And I would actually venture to say that some of the realities that were shared in this video are not exclusive to college campuses. The work that I've engaged with young people across different cities in the United States, I can start in Harlem in New York City, where I will actually share some data from students. There are similar stories being shared from students at Perennial High School, where I've done some work, and at Harlem High School. Stories of not being engaged because of the racial undertone or the racist undertone. There are students in Charleston, South Carolina, who I talk with, who feel as if the realities confronting them on a daily basis get ignored. And if they're getting ignored when they walk inside of classrooms, these realities, these oppressions, these injustices, then how are they supposed to perform academically and be academically successful when there is no mechanism in place to actually support the struggles that they actually experience? Two, students in Columbus, Ohio, where I did a lot of work for the last 9.5 years working with the school district and its teachers union, its board, its mayor's office, and thinking critically with principals in particular about the types of structures we need to have in place that aren't just structures where we're talking about students passing standardized tests. Yes, that's a reality. But we're also talking about changing the world. We're talking about preparing students to be advocates and activists. We're talking about preparing students to be critical thinkers with a level of consciousness where they could actually say, that's wrong, and these are the reasons why. And they could also say, my stories are important and valid. How do we do that work? And how do we model the practices and strategies that we are teaching inside of classrooms with and for our students? And yet, I go to South Carolina. I go to my home state, South Carolina. And this is what happens in some of the schools in South Carolina. Do we know what this is? Do we recognize this? How can I talk about modeling behavior when I turn on the television or I speak to teachers in my home state of South Carolina, or in fact any other state across this United States, and we have the reality of kids being body slammed inside of schools by people who are supposed to be there to protect them? How do I talk about modeling practices when we have students who are scarred by the people who are supposed to teach and love and care and protect them? You know, I've sat with this image, not playing the video. I'm sure you've seen it, and if you haven't, it's on Google. You can Google it. And it is disheartening, to say the least. And yet, I walk into classrooms, and I'm talking with students about why it's important to be critical readers and writers. And they're pushing back at me, and they're saying, but I just want to live. So how are you going to teach me to be a critical reader and writer when my life is on the line when I walk into this school building? That there is a point that we need to interrupt and disrupt. And we need to have conversations about the structures that are in place that actually allow students to enter into school spaces feeling as if there's some kind of alienation that's there or a sense of unbelonging. How do we do this work? How do we do this work when we prepare our students inside of our K-12 or pre-K-12 teaching and education experiences, and many of them going off to college feeling, as this image actually portrays in a story that came out in February 2016, that when it comes to protests in education, it's like, quote, the 1960s for so many college freshmen. According to this article, a new survey report shows that 8.5% of current college freshmen just completing high school expect to participate in student protests while in college. That figure is up by 2.9 percentage points from 2014, and it is the highest percentage to respond that way in the annual survey since this survey has been given since 1967. How do we make sense of this reality? How do we make sense of this reality? How do we talk openly and critically about these things and yet do this work in the context of teaching and teacher education? So it's my belief that I have to start somewhere, and I start here. I start with the fundamental belief that there can be no room for hate. And I start my teaching, and I start all of my learning experiences with other people, and I start my own stories with the belief that if we are committed to high quality, engaged teaching and learning with ourselves, with students, with our colleagues, with anyone, we have to begin with the understanding that we can have absolutely no room for hate. I'm going to say that one more time. We have no room for hate. We have room for differences and diversities. We have room for people who might have opinions that are not our own, that we might not share. But we start with some kind of common core value and belief that there is no room for hate at all. And in this context today, there is no room for hate in teaching and teacher education. How do we make sure we actually come to that understanding? So what I want to do, I want to talk about how there is no room for hate. And I'm going to connect that to that high leverage practice. But in order to do that, I have three major terms that I've been grappling with and that actually are part of my topic for today. And one is justice, one is engagement, and one is humanization. And so I want to actually just present some basic understandings that I have, and these understandings are informed by so many other scholars, but primarily by high school students who have invited me into their classrooms to teach them, and who've invited me into their communities to get to know their families. I start with this concept of justice. And it's my belief, as so many other people have written, that justice is a framework, and it encourages us to examine so many different things, from oppression to privilege to unequal power relations that operate to maintain hierarchies. Justice as a framework allows us to reject these hierarchies in order to advocate for universal human rights and educational justice. And so when I think about justice, I think about the scholarship that has been done by different researchers and practitioners. Research on achievement gaps, on racial, ethnic, and linguistic misrepresentations, on racial segregation, and I should say resegregation in public schools and communities. Research on gender inequalities, bullying of LGBTQI+ students, the miseducation of students with disabilities, disparities in educational resources, and so many others. So a justice orientation, in my opinion, is in fact committed to transforming oppressive practices, policies, decisions, curricula, institutions. We've got to work against inequities and social inequalities. I turned to Bettina Love really quickly in 2017. And when I think about justice, I do believe that we have to move toward justice. We live in a world where dehumanization is a reality for so many different communities, including so many students who I work with. And the question of how do we move toward justice? I think we start with someone like Bettina Love, or we go to someone like Bettina Love, who writes that in the United States, we are obsessed with dehumanizing and criminalizing the Black body. Black people, regardless of gender, are being killed in the streets and spirit murdered in the classroom. When I first read that earlier this year, I was like, my stomach's hurting. Like, are you kidding me? This idea, the spirit murdered in the classroom? Are you kidding? I'm gonna take that in. Spirit murdered in the classroom. When classrooms are supposed to be spaces of critical and insightful engagement and collaboration and deep thought and learning and questioning and debating. And the reality is that some classrooms are spirit murdering our young people. And I would say by extension, our adults, some of the teachers in our classrooms too. That's hard to take. And I want to actually think about justice in relation to classrooms not being spaces and places that engage in spirit murdering. What might that look like? But that other term is engagement. And for me, I see engagement as community-centric. Engagement is inclusive. It's collaborative and it's intentional. It's transformative, it's humanizing. Engagement connects directly to justice. Engagement means that we're working with other people on issues and topics and problems. And how do we do this work? Engagement, for me, also represents intentional, meaningful collaborations. And I'm not saying meaningful, but food with meaning, meaningful collaborations. We can talk about engagement in teaching and teacher education just as much as we can talk about engagement in our familial communities. We can talk about engagement when we talk about activist-oriented work. We can talk about engagement when we talk about working with other people to solve some kind of big world issue or some kind of particular small community issue. It is the ways in which we think with other people about what it means, in my opinion, to be a part of a community space that I hope is advocating for some kind of social, political, educational change. And I say this a lot to folks I work with, and I'm serious about this. Engagement, like justice, these are important concepts because, it's Audre Lorde who writes that our lives depend on this. Our lives depend, I believe, on the ways we understand engagement as connected to justice. And if we can understand engagement as connected to justice, then we are doing this work because it is important to do the work with and for other people and not just singularly ourselves. It's Yolanda Sealy Ruiz in 2016 who writes about engagement, in my opinion. And for her, she sees this work as interrupting violence, pedagogical injustices, and misrepresentations. And she's arguing that we do this work through writing, through visual art, through spoken word and other modalities. She argues these things provide an outlet for us to discuss, critique, and dismantle this violence. So for me, when I think about Yolanda's work, I think about the ways in which we can talk about, for example, racial literacy. I think about how we can talk about oppression and justice as we think about the ways literacy must be central to this work. We write, we think, we use visual art, we use spoken word, we use a variety of modalities, and hopefully these things get us to interrupt violence, reject violence, but also to question who we are as we work with other people in the world. And then finally, that third word that's in the subtitle of my presentation is humanization. So this is a wordy slide, and that's purposeful because I think it was about 7 years ago, give or take, when I went back to New York City. I went back and revisited some of the work I did in Harlem with Philip, Khalik, Damon, Rebecca, Samantha, Kim, Miss L, and all these other wonderful people. And we use the word humanization. And I use it without thinking about it. But I think it was Philip who said, yeah, what does that mean? Like, humanization, humanizing, human. Yeah, so Val, what does that mean? And whenever a young person calls me Val, it's like, oh, this is some serious conversation here. What does humanization mean? We talked about it. We really debated that meaning, that word. And we came up with humanization, conscious attempts by educators and students to do something different. And in this case, to move away from unspoken antagonism and negative beliefs about each other so we can get on with the business of work, so we can share and create knowledge. Humanization as pedagogy and as practice, particularly for Philip, requires all of us to begin valuing experiences, perspectives, and cultural knowledge that young people already have. They already have. We're not teaching these things. They walk into our classrooms already with a set of experiences that we need to name and honor. It requires that we honor, quote, the complexities of our humanity in relation to other people's lived conditions and in light of what it means to teach, to learn, and to live in the world. And it was that conversation and then a series of other conversations with Philip in New York City's Harlem community where I really started thinking about this idea of projects and humanization. And, it's like, but what happens when you walk into a classroom and as a student, you know you're being dehumanized by your teacher and by your other peers? What happens? What is it that you should do or say? How do you stand up against this? And I think to do this kind of work, we move toward humanization, like we move toward engagement and justice. And moving toward humanization for me and for my co-authors, Tanya Burkhardt and Carlotta Penn, it means that we recognize histories of colonization and violence and oppression that have dehumanized the lives and dehumanize the stories of historically marginalized people. That we allow researchers, and that have allowed researchers to oppressively claim those stories as their own. It's this thing where I want to hear your story. I want you to tell me your story, as Bell Hooks writes, only to have your story told back to you as if it's my story. That's dehumanization, and that's not moving toward humanization. Moving toward humanization in teaching and teacher education could look like this. What is your story? I want to hear your voice. And when you tell me your story, I want you to share your story with other people. And I want to learn something from your story that can connect to this larger issue that we've been grappling with in this classroom around a topic or a theme or a practice. That's valuing voice, and that's valuing lived experiences. And that's the kind of work that I'm after, and that I hope other people are after as well. So, we have justice, we have engagement, and we have humanization. I've showed you images of things happening in the world. I've shown you images of things happening in the world that I think we need to question and that we need to interrupt and disrupt. But then how do we take this larger, these things are happening in the world, and begin to make sense of these things happening in the world in relation to the particularities of classroom spaces with young people? So I return to that high leverage practice. What does any of what I just said have to do with explaining and modeling content or practices or strategies? What might the incidences happening at Boston College or Ithaca College or even here at Michigan have to do with what we're supposed to be doing in teaching and teacher education, particularly around this practice? I think the connection is, for me, sort of rooted in these questions, these core questions. And these questions have a lot to do with how we affirm students inside of our schools, how we recognize their critical agencies and critical capacities, and also how we attend to what young people are saying about justice, engagement, and humanity. And what you notice here is that there's, in each of these questions, there's something about practices, pedagogies, and stances. Did I do that? All right. And so this last question here, what do their stories tell us about our practices, our pedagogies, and our stances? that has to also connect to this first question about affirming students in schools. How are young people being affirmed in schools? And what might our practices say about whether we are affirming or not affirming young people inside of schools? But also, how do we understand agency? I think we have a tendency to talk about agency and critical capacity as if we're all on the same page and we all understand what those things mean. But understanding theoretically what these terms mean and then putting them into practice are two different things. So how do we do this work? For me, and for so many of the young people I work with, we have to talk about living at intersections. And so then this work becomes informed by the intersections about language, place, culture, and race. And these are some of the scholars who inform the approach that we take in this work. And we being me, of course, we being the teachers who've invited me into their world, we being the students who I work with and who I continue to work with on a daily basis, and we also being families and community members. How do we take this work up? So if I'm talking about justice, I can't really talk about justice without also talking about language. The language that we use to make sure that we are engaging in practices that relate to, that reflect a framework of justice. If I'm talking about engagement, I have to talk about place and research on place. And it's, Geneva Gay, Gilroy, all of these people who talk about the value of thinking about the situatedness of place, thinking about context because location matters. And how do we attend to people's place or context as we go into schools working with them? And so the work is informed by all of these various intersections and the scholarship around language, place, race, and culture. And so I want to actually try to figure out with you what this could look like, and this being whatever this high leverage practice is in relation to what young people are doing and in relation to what they're telling us. And so it's not that I am modeling practices and behaviors for them as much as we're doing this modeling with each other in our classrooms and in our communities. And it's about what they say and what they do that get us to think about what it means when we talk about explaining and modeling content or practices and strategies. So I want to take these questions here, and I want to take that high leverage practice, and I want to take these intersections, and I want to jump full steam ahead into some data and into what this might look like in a variety of contexts. And the context that I'm going to be talking about come from New York City and Columbus, Ohio, for example. And it's about the words you see here. It's about the work as being humanizing. It's about students who are saying, let me just be who I am and let me talk about freedom. Let me talk about what I think justice means. And for Philip and Khalik in particular, but also for Derek and Christina, who I'll share with you some of their videos, it's also about what's in the center. For Philip, and he's clear, I can't talk about this work if I can't talk about being a black male, a black man in America. I can't. Everything for Philip is about understanding blackness. Blackness as situated within a particular historical context, blackness as situated within a contemporary context. And for Philip, it is also about, I am a black person living in Harlem and New York City. And I am expected to be successful when the assumptions about me are assumptions that are negative and based in deficit perspectives. How am I supposed to do this work? So we all agreed we have to talk about race. I want to take you to New York City. And so what I want to do, I want to journey all the way to New York City first, and then I want to journey to Columbus, Ohio, and then I want to offer some commentary on both. And then I want to return to this high-level leverage practice, this practice that tells us that we need to model content strategies and practices. And I want to think with you about how to do this work in this current socio-political landscape, but also if we're expecting teachers to engage in this work with students, What might it mean for principals to also understand that there should be an investment from them in this work as well? So that's where I want to take you. I'm going to start in New York City. And I'm going to start with Christina, because I've recently written about Christina. And Christina posed some really interesting challenges for me, not for her. I asked myself many questions when I worked with Christina. And Christina and I met when I was teaching a senior level high school English language arts class at Perennial High School in New York City in 2007. And I was also a professor at Teachers College at the time, really thinking about methods, thinking about how to prepare student teachers to enter into urban educational contexts. And then Christina walked into my high school classroom. And this is what happened. She stood at 4 feet 5 inches tall and mid-size heels, arms waggling in the air, eyes offering a stare that could cut through steel. This girl was on fire. She walked as if to say, I don't care who you are, move out of the way because I'm coming through. And Christina came through day after day within my English classroom where I initially met her, and within the out-of-classroom spaces where I came to know Christina as more than a girl on fire. Christina was a girl whose fire represented ways of surviving in a world of peers and adults who, according to her, often misunderstood and dismissed her. And so when we first met, she looked at me, hand on hip, and she said, "You tall? You tall. And you like so tall that I can't even, and I'm waiting for it." And I'm like, oh gosh, this is what we're going to start our relationship with. And she says, I can't even see all of you because you're so tall. I interrogated her comment not as a joke about height, but granted, I am a black woman who stands at 6 feet tall, so I am tall, but as a confession about not being fully seen. I laughed. She responded, look, you don't know me, I don't know you. If you want to keep it that way, fine. I'm going to let you know straight up, this is me. You don't want to have me here, and that's just too bad because I'm here. And then she did this thing with her body. She did like a sharp turn, as if she was cutting corners in a Cadillac, or she was trying to cut me for that matter. I had one of two choices to make. I could remain silent, and I could lose face as the English teacher in a class of 29 plus high school seniors, or I could recognize that Christina was performing a narrative of difference that was enacted onto her by her peers and to the adults in her class. And so I responded by understanding that that was a narrative that she was performing. So I said, it's very nice to meet you, Christina. I guess we'll learn a lot about each other this semester or this year. And she replied, yeah, right, whatever, Ms. And that Ms. was like a bee buzz sounding sort of zzz. And she just kind of looked at me. And, and before I could respond, she said, oh, by the way, Miss, you teach in this class. You need to know we don't write. We don't write in here. I don't write, and we don't write. Do you? And she walked away. And she went in the back of the classroom. And I remember this like it was yesterday. She walked away. She went in the back of the classroom. And I just went, like, what are you supposed to do? And in New York City in particular, students walk into the classroom, and on the board is do, noun. This is what you're supposed to do right now. So think about or write something about. And so she walked in, and I looked at her, and I just went, okay, what do we do with that? And instead of looking at Christina as if she had a problem, I actually looked at the institution of public education. And I started talking with her other teachers, and it was true. When she eventually said to me, I'm an A student, I get an A on everything, I get an A on everything. Okay, miss? And then I collected her writings. And there was a disconnect, between her getting an A on everything and her actually getting an A on everything because her teachers passed her on. And so we had a conversation in class. And this is what Christina had to say. And this was probably about maybe a good month and a half in. We were reading texts by Jonathan Kozo and Bell Hooks. We were talking about race in America. We were talking about literacy narratives. And Christina shared this with me. She said, "You said to talk about race, place, and justice. Is that right? But how are we supposed to do that when all of us, every one of us in this room, know that schools don't really want us to talk about them things? They don't, because then they'll know that we're being critical and that, well, like Aureliano said in class yesterday, that we know. We all know these schools don't really care about us. So where is the justice? Why put us through the pain of talking about something that we don't have and might never even get?" And my heart dropped. And everyone just said, yeah. So we can sit in here and talk all day about race, place, and justice. We know the reality. But the reality is schools don't want us to know and schools don't care. So why are we doing this in this classroom? How do you respond to that? You know? And you're on the spot and you have 30-something students looking at you. And these students are about to graduate high school. Talk about modeling some kind of practice or disposition. How do you do that? So my first thought was, we're talking about Bell Hooks. What does she have to offer? But we read Bell Hooks, and they read Bell Hooks, and they talked about Bell Hooks, and Christina Stowe said this. Then we had some Paulo Freire, because I believe in bringing in Freire in the high school classroom, and we talked about it. So I may have said something like, you know, we have to read the world, and then a student finished, and the word, we know. It's like, I'm losing ground here. And, you know, then Jonathan Kozo. We read some of his work, and someone said, that's depressing at best. Because when I read Jonathan Kozo and I look at our classroom, I look at our school, I look at our community, I feel like he could be writing about us. And I don't want to read that again. So we know what these people say. And I think it was Aureliano who came back with, let's actually look at what Christina is talking about. Say it again. And what she said again was this line that says, why put us through the pain of talking about something that we don't have and might never even get? And I had about 10 minutes left in the classroom. So we talked about it. And I said, let's name this pain. What is the pain? Is it alienation? And someone said miscommunication. And someone said not being seen as smart. And someone said being seen as dumb. And someone else said, Christina, all right, remember when we first met and I said I'm an A student? I know I'm not an A student, but teachers tell me I am because they don't want to deal with me. So I'm an A student. How do you deal with that type of pain? And when your teachers are giving it to you? And then it was Demaya who actually said, Christina, I've never had a conversation with you beyond telling you to sit down or stop doing what you're doing in the 4 years of being here. And I've treated you wrong. How do we actually talk about the pain in ways where we can name it, and then for me, write about it and reflect on it? And that's what we did for that class session and for the following class session. And then we shared literacy narratives about pain. And it was one of the most powerful experiences. And then they said, if we're doing this work, you have to do it too. And I did. And I shared my literacy narrative about pain. I shared my narrative about being a first-generation college student. I shared my narrative about having a father who didn't graduate from middle school and a mother who wanted to be a public school teacher but couldn't in the 60s. We talked about pain. And it was at that moment where I started to believe when we think about modeling content and practices, it is about what's going on in the lives of our young people. It is about understanding that they have voice. And it is inviting that voice into classrooms, even if it gets us off of our lesson plans. It is about that slide that I showed you, doing this work because lives depend on it. And for Christina and her peers, doing this work as seniors, that was the pain for me because they were about to graduate. But doing the work allowed us to process that pain. I go to Khalik. And I haven't actually showed Khalik in a talk or in a class in a long time. Khalik, this was probably in 2006, the semester or so before he graduated high school. And we had, a multi-year project on literacy and gentrification in New York City's Harlem community. We're sitting in the teacher's lounge, and probably about 15 or so of us are in there doing lunch break, and we're having our session. And I say, oh, Khalik, you ready? Interview? And he's like, oh, yes, let's do this interview. And Philip, who I've talked about already today, one of his peers, he had the video camera. And Philip is like, Val, I got this. And so he videotaped Khalik, and he asked Khalik questions about literacy. And we all sat there, guidance counselors, English teacher, me, a few of his other peers, about 15 of us or so, and we just went, wait, did you just say that? And this is what he said.
I don't think at my grade level, to be honest with you. I think I have like the thoughts and everything. I just not writing at where I should be.
Do you think you're on college level writing?
No.
Are you close to it?
No.
Getting there?
Maybe getting there, but I don't think close.
What grade level you think you're on with your writing?
Maybe like the 10th grade level. I'm not improving as fast as I could improve in order to be at the college level, to be with the peers in college.
The videotape turned off, and Philip was like, okay, let's stop. So he turned it off, and we're all sitting there. And it was Philip who actually went back to Khalik and said, so we've been going to this school for 4 years. We're about to graduate in a few weeks, and this was a few weeks before graduation. And so are you please, Khalik, a 10th grade reading level? And Khalik sat there, much like how he's sitting here in this chair, and he said, yes. All right, I'm just lying. I'm kidding. So we're like, oh, okay, all right. So what's the truth? And he was like, I don't think I'm on a 10th grade, maybe an 8th, 9th grade at best, probably not even that much. And I look at his teacher, Miss Hardman, and she looks at me. And then I look at all the other students who are in this lounge at the time, and we're just like sitting there in silence. And I said, Khalik, I've known you for about 3 years now. You're about to graduate high school. I've seen your grades. So let's go back to this. You see yourself on an 8th grade reading and or writing level? And he said, yes, I do. But I'd never say it on camera, because what does that say about my schooling? That has stayed with me. And when I contact Philip and Khalik and their English teacher still to this day, I still ask them the same question. What about our schooling system or about our teaching, engagement practices, pedagogies that continue to fail so many of our kids? How can we be graduating kids from any school in this country when they know they're not on grade level? What have we not afforded them? And it's not to put blame on young people. It is to put blame on a system that has disadvantaged our young people, particularly our students of color, from being high, successful achievers. And so Khalik eventually went to college. And Khalik eventually decided, I've got to get this thing that I didn't get in high school. And he got it. And he graduated. And, he's now a police officer in New York City, thinking that he would never go into law enforcement because I don't like them. And he went into law enforcement because he wanted to join them in order to make the world a better place. But without that resilience, I question where would Khalik be given the disservice that was enacted onto him. There's a lot of stuff that we can learn from Khalik that I'll get back to. But for now, I want to go all the way to Columbus, Ohio. I want to put a hold right there on Khalik and Christina. I'm going to offer some commentary on the two of them shortly. But I want to travel all the way to Columbus, Ohio, because that's where I spent almost the last 10 years of my academic life at Ohio State University. And in Columbus, I had the benefit of working with about 82 public school teachers and guidance counselors and occupational therapists. I was able to work with principals and teachers union representatives, including the president of the largest teachers union in the state of Ohio. And we talked about engagement. And the challenge was set. How can we think differently about teaching and learning in this large urban school district in Columbus, Ohio? And we actually came up with the idea of doing a different type of professional development opportunity for our teachers. And so it's through this experience where I met, yet again, many brilliant students and teachers. And the first student I want to talk about is Derek. Because Derek was about 5 feet 6 inches tall. When I first met him, head half bowed, eyes dreaming of something that was very far away. He was neither passive nor quiet, but as he eventually shared with me, I'm always thinking. I'm always thinking about something better. I'm always reaching for something better. Some of his peers and teachers didn't always understand his desire for better because they would oftentimes label him as lazy or angry or troubled or, Ms. Valerie, you might not want to mess with Derek. So we first met in the hallway of this high school in Columbus, leading to an English classroom where he was going and where I was also going to. I accidentally bumped into him, and I recall he saying, "Excuse me, you just bumped into me." And I said, "I'm sorry." And he gave me that look. And I said, "My bad." He walked into his English classroom. I followed him. He turned around and he said, "I don't know who you are, but why are you following me?" And so this was our interaction. And we just went back and forth. I walked into the classroom. I sat in a chair. Didn't realize he was going to sit next to me, and so that whole sort of interaction started off interestingly. But it was later when a student suggested that I don't mess with Derek, that I leave him be. But in my mind and in my heart and in my soul, I knew that I couldn't. And so for days, the question that he threw to me, "Who you talking to?" when I asked him what he was actually studying in his class. He asked me that question as if he dared me to answer it, and yet he seemed to want me to answer it. So the next time I ran into Derek outside of this classroom was by the school's front office. And here I go. I was like, "Hey, Derek, how's it going?" And he looked at me again. "Who are you talking to?" And I said, "I'm talking to you." Eventually, over time, Derek and I actually established a relationship, and it allowed me to get a closer glimpse into his literacy life and also his familial life. And there was a writing assignment that his teacher and I gave him and his peers. And he sat there and he thought, well, if I can change anything in the world, what would it be? And then he wrote this essay. And I'm going to play this so you can hear his voice.
If I could change anything I wanted, I would change my attitude and behavior towards my peers, the staff at my high school, and most importantly, my family. I don't know why, but I do have some troubles with following directions that are given to me by adults. I try my hardest to control that problem, but most of the time I be bored, so I give adults a hard time for no reason at all. I would give almost anything in the world just to be normal, not disrespect or be rude anymore.
So that's the first part of his essay. And, it's that part that still grabs at me. I would give almost anything in the world just to be normal and not disrespectful or rude anymore. And so we needed to do a lot of unpacking here. Normal, not rude, not disrespectful. And so he continued with his essay.
I think I disrespect adults a lot because I don't have my dad in my life. I have not seen my dad in about a year. My dad does not call on holidays or my birthday. He don't even try to put himself in my life. Why? I do not know. Maybe it's because he has too many kids to keep up with. I try not to let this bother me as much because I still have my mom, my grandmother, my older brother, and my younger sister, also my uncle. I really don't need my dad at all. I just really want to graduate so I could tell him that I did it without him. Maybe that would encourage him to be in his younger kids' lives.
So there's another part to the essay that I'll play in a second, but I want to stay on this slide for a moment. He says, I think I disrespect adults a lot because I don't have my dad in my life. But then he jumps to the end of this particular part, and he says, I don't really need my dad at all. But then he says, I just really want to graduate. So we had a lot of talking to do, and we did. And we talked about this essay. And I talked with him about the idea coming from the first part of this essay about normal and this idea of normalization. What does that mean? You want to be normal. What does that mean? And particularly for you, a senior in this class, what does it mean for you to be normal? I'm not sure I understand that. And so he talked about normal in the context of the behaviors of other people in his class and in his school. And I remember clearly, it was after he wrote this, his teacher and I sat, we read it, and we were like, wow, Derek, a student who would sit in a classroom with his head half bowed. Derek, who I accidentally bumped into, who didn't want to talk to me at all for a really long time. Derek. And Derek wrote this essay. And it's clear that Derek was grappling and struggling and trying to process some things going on in his out-of-school life that directly impact his in-school life. But if we didn't know that, we wouldn't be able to actually work with Derek to actually help him see his full potential, as opposed to him thinking, I'm not going to graduate, I'm giving everyone trouble. So a few things we needed to model. We needed to model for Derek, as well as his peers, this belief that we have to question these languages and these terms and terminologies that we use, and normal being one of them. The idea of respect and disrespect, we needed to talk about the politics of respectability. We needed to talk about what that means and how it is oftentimes enacted onto people that they have to behave and perform in a certain way in order to gain respect. We need to interrogate all of that. And we also need to interrogate this idea of not wanting to be rude anymore. Rude according to whom? Rude because you've gotten what kind of narrative placed onto you. And for me, it was really important to take a step back and to understand how I need to try to invite myself a little more into Derek's life so I can understand his essay, but I also can understand that he was modeling certain behaviors in school that were not really understood by other people in school. Prime example, we're in the hallway talking about this essay. And it's probably the first time that we had a full conversation without him saying, who are you looking at? And we're talking about this essay, and it is just, we're going back and forth. So he reads a part of it, I read a part of it, we're having conversations. And then something happens. And then he looks down the hallway, and he sees people running. And it's like, I want to tell him, don't move. Let's talk about this essay. But he sees folks, and he hears voices, and he hears his name. And at that point, I know that our conversation is over because he needs to get down the hallway because there's a fight. And his homeboy is in this fight. And he needs to get down this hallway. So he runs down the hallway. Our conversation is over. And next thing I know, Derek is suspended for 10 days. But the folks who are in the fight are in school the next day. And it's like, how do we get to a point where we're questioning this normalization, this respectability politics, at the same time that we are questioning these larger narratives that circulate around certain types of students? So Derek was labeled from the beginning. Hence, when I first described Derek to you and I said, people said, leave him alone, let him be, it's because of all of these narratives that were enacted, that were placed on Derek. So Derek eventually came back, and we talked about it. And Derek said, I feel a tug of war, because on the one hand, I want to do this work. I want to be successful. But on the other hand, I'm already labeled in this school. And so I'm just going to do what I think I should do. We get to the end of his essay, and then he writes,
I'm done playing the blame game. It's all me, and it's time to accept the fact that I messed up and change. My man Gandhi once said, be the change that you wish to see in the world. If I could live up to this quote, I would, but I feel like something is holding me back. But we all know that's just an excuse, so I'm just going to try and live every day in peace.
Are you kidding me? Derek is quoting Gandhi. And Derek is talking about accepting the fact that I messed up. But he's quoting Gandhi. If I could live up to this quote, be the change that you wish to see in the world. And I went back to the English teacher and I said, did you all study Gandhi this year? Because I may have missed that lesson. She's like, no Gandhi. I went back to his 11th grade English teacher. I was like, did you all study Gandhi? No. This is a kid who, he's not even performing a narrative. He's not performing a narrative of resistance. He's actually operating within a school culture that has failed him in so many ways. And he says, I'm done playing the blame game. And when I pushed back at that, he really pushed back at me. And I finally said, we're going to disagree, but this is what I think. You aren't done playing the blame game because everything that you have here is putting the blame on you. You're talking about you're accepting the fact that you messed up, that you're accepting the fact that you need to change, that you're accepting the fact that something's holding you back. But you want to live every day in peace. How do we rewrite that narrative? How do we rewrite that narrative? And that's what I asked Derek. And unfortunately, Derek said sometimes you can't rewrite certain narratives. And that was the part that got me. It's in this slide here, he says about his father. But then he also says, I just really want to graduate so I can tell him, my father, I did it without him. He wants to graduate. He wants to go to college. And this very first slide, he sets the stage for saying, this is what I would want to change. So I said to Derek, all right, if there are some narratives that you think can't be changed, how about we put that to the test? How about we take your essay in, the full essay, and we use it as a teaching tool? And we take all references to you out. So your name's not on it. And we're just going to use it as a teaching tool with other students in this class. And we're going to see what they think about this particular narrative, about this particular essay. And we did. And it was amazing, how students responded to his essay and how he sat there participating as if he didn't write it. But people are responding to his essay and basically trying to help us understand the ways that these narratives can change and shift, and how we need to interrupt and disrupt certain narratives in order for those narratives to be the narratives that we really want. And he sat there and he listened, and then we talked. And then he said, I'm still not sure how to change certain narratives, but I know that I could. So the first narrative that I'm going to change is that what you just modeled for me by inviting everyone to respond to my essay, that gave me hope. So the first thing I'm going to try to change, I'm graduating from high school. I'm graduating from high school. And I'm not going to not graduate because other people think I can't. And he graduated from high school. That was one narrative that he sought to change, and he did. And I can't say it enough. Our students are brilliant. Our students know the work. Our students need to be given opportunities to perform at the levels that they can perform at. And we need to ask different types of questions about engagement. And we need to ask different types of questions about justice and about equity. And when we ask those questions, we have to invite our students to respond. And when we get their responses, we have to understand that we might not agree, but their responses are valid and should be seen as text in our classrooms. That's how we think about modeling content and strategies with students. I want to start to wind down a bit. And I want to wind down a bit by now turning to one more example of work happening in Columbus, Ohio. And, Chelsea and Rendell, two students I work with in Columbus. They participated actively in our service learning and community engagement grant. And it's Chelsea who talks about finally having an English teacher who cares about her, who listens to her, and who actually sees her potential. And finally having a teacher who happens to be an English teacher who finally gets her and can push her outside of her comfort zone. And then it's Rendell. And Rendell amazing. Rendell talks about how he is oftentimes seen as a statistic because of who he is, because of how he looks, because of his upbringing. And he actually says, I might be from a single-family home. I might be from an urban community. But you know what? I'm going to resist that label of being a statistic. And I want to share with you just briefly what they had to say. And the context for this is a National Education Association conference that we went to in Atlanta. And they got on stage and they talked about their project. And it's about 1,000 people in the room, all teachers and teacher educators. And I said, just talk. Do what you know how to do and talk about who you are. And so this is Chelsea, and then Rendell will follow.
This project, I've learned that I love to help people and I want to give back to the community because growing up, a lot of people had to help me. And I just feel like it's now my time to pay them back.
I was looking at the statistics and not, the young black males that don't graduate, but the empowerment of my teacher had helped me get over that and had got my mentality right. Now I wake up every morning looking success right in the eye.
So a little more context. So Chelsea started the Service Learning Project when she was a 9th grade high school student in Ms. Washington's, or Ms. Moore, I write about, in her English Language Arts classroom. And the project was only for 9th graders, and then her teacher actually registered for one of the courses I offered on critical approaches to service learning and community engagement. And so she took this course with me, a graduate level PD course. And she realized, I'm doing service learning without the critical part. I'm doing this work with students. How do I do this work with community partners or a community agency? So she went back to her school and she decided, I am going to work with students because this is the project you wanted to do. And they created an urban community garden, a fruit and vegetable garden. There were about 20% of the student population at this entire school who use mobility devices, so whether wheelchairs or walkers. And so in creating this garden, a student realized, we have a garden, it's accessible to everyone in the school, but 20% of our student population can't actually access this garden. So they decided, we're going to create some cement pavers. They watched Miss Washington in class. She modeled certain behaviors and dispositions, all about care, all about engagement, all about treating people the way you want to be treated. And so instead of her saying, we need to do this, the students said, we need to create cement pavers so everyone can have access to this fruit and vegetable garden. And then they contacted Home Depot. And then they got Home Depot to come out and teach them how to create these cement pavers. And then they created the cement pavers. And now everyone has access to all the garden beds. Amazing work from young people. So that's Chelsea. And she was like, we need to do this, and we need to actually do this and now do a disability ability campaign awareness in our school. Because students need to understand how to take care of other students. And that's what they did. And then there is Rendell, working right with Chelsea and other peers. And Rendell says, you know what, Valerie, it's not just about a garden. It is about the fact that you have different types of students who've taken different classes with each other, who are engaging with each other in this garden. What? We never have that happen. And so Rendell also became really interested in thinking about his role in this project, but his role in school. And he actually said, I read a lot about how many black males are statistics, particularly when they grow up in an environment that I grew up in. And through this project, as he said, and it's worth hearing again, I think.
The young black males that don't graduate, but the empowerment of my teacher had helped me get over that and had got my mentality right. Now I wake up every morning looking success right in the eye.
Like, that's Rendell, high school senior. And he's saying, look at success in the eye. After all of this time going through K-12 schooling and realizing just before I graduate, wait, I am not a statistic? I'm a success? I am? And what might that mean? And for him to give credit to his teacher who was standing right next to him, that's the work that we do. And that's the work that we do with our young people inside of our schools and communities. And finally, how might this work get done inside of schools if we don't have the support of principals? And so Mr. Alston is one of the many principals who participated in this project. And Mr. Alston said at the very beginning of this, he was quite clear. He said, Dr. Kinloch, I want to make sure you understand that I'm signing on to actually having you come into our schools and work with teachers, but I'm going to be honest with you. My commitment is to make sure that our students can pass these standardized tests, because that's what they need to do. And it's like, standardized tests. Ugh. So how do we talk about standardized tests at the same time that we're talking about engagement and achievement? Because I don't believe standardized tests measure one's brilliance. I don't. And yet that's a reality. So we're having class in the library of his high school about 4:30 to 6:50 p.m. We have about 30 teachers there from different schools in the district. And in this particular scene here, Mr. Alston stands up, and what he says is, I've been sitting here, I've been listening to these young people, and I'm convinced that this works. This is the type of engagement that we need. And I think that's the work that we have to do. And this is Mr. Alston.
Give freedom for ideas. You have to allow people to think outside the box, because the larger picture, the greater picture here is, how will students be affected? Will they want to be engaged? Will we improve relationships? And those things, when you want to teach students, those things are more important than trying to stick to the curriculum. Now we can probably go further in the curriculum if we establish the relationships, and then we make sure students are engaged in what they're doing, and then we can find the connections to the curriculum. We obviously see these students they can relate to what's going on now. They can express how it affects their community, and I think when they sit down and they have the conversation about connecting those ideas and those feelings to the curriculum, they'll be able to get a much deeper understanding of whatever we're teaching. So bravo to these.
So that's Mr. Alston. After almost a year or so of doing this project, he comes and he's still sort of like, And then he sees students get up and talking about the various projects that they've been doing connected to the curriculum, but also connected to the mission of a community organization that they have identified wanting to partner with, and now connected to the work of a community garden, where it's not just about a garden. It's also about access to fresh fruit and vegetables, yes. It's also about giving food to people in the community who might not have access to fresh fruit and vegetable. It is also about thinking a little more expansively about what it means to engage in this work with and for other people. And that's what these young folks have taught me, and that's how they have actually helped me to think about my practices and what my practices mean. So for the sake of time, I want to actually bring some of this to an end. We have these guiding questions that I shared earlier. And what I want to do is just to quickly think about these guiding questions now that I've shown you some data, and think about how do we now talk about that high leverage practice of modeling content and practices and strategies. If we go back to this first question about are students being affirmed in schools, I argue that students must be affirmed in schools, and one way for us to engage in this work is by really thinking critically about the practices, the pedagogies, and the stances that we bring to this work. Are we inviting students into conversations? Are we reading text with students that actually get them to think deeply about who they are in the world, or who other people are in the world, that get them to question and interrogate larger concepts and understandings? And are our practices culturally relevant and sustaining? And if not, I think we need to ask ourselves why. Do we recognize their agency and critical capacities? So if we're thinking about our students and as agentive beings with critical capacities to learn, then we have to think about how are we teaching our students in our classrooms. And it's not just about what texts we are using, but it's also about who we are, what we are bringing to the classroom experience. It is the conversation that we have with our students. It is the way that we acknowledge our students' presence, that we can name them and call them by the name that they want to be called by. It is about working closely to understand that if a student is absent, it does not mean that that student just doesn't want to be there. There might be something going on. So it's about the familial to professional connection. What's going on in people's familial communities might actually have an impact on what's going on in their school lives. And we have to attend to those things, and we have to have practices that actually allow us to think deeply about what that might mean with our students. And then this last question, what do our students say about justice, engagement, and humanity? Well, we have the example from Rendell. And we have Rendell who says, I'm not a statistic. I'm not a statistic. I'm not a statistic. I'm a success. I think that relates to humanity. We have the example of Chelsea who says that, participating in this project has just taught me so many things about myself that I didn't even think about before. That's an example, I think, of engagement. And then we have justice. And one would say that the example I shared by Christina and the example of Derek might not speak to justice, but it does. It speaks to justice insofar as young people being able to tell their stories, even if those stories are painful. Even if those stories go against who we are and what we might believe, those stories belong to our young people. Those stories must be a part of our teaching, and we need to grapple with those stories as if those stories will always be there. How do we do this work? And that's the question. And so finally, I leave you with these ideas that I continue to think about. And they seem simplistic, they do. I admit this. But in my opinion, it's harder to actually do this. And so the first is listen. And when I say listen, I'm not saying I want you to hear what I'm saying and then say what you were thinking. I'm saying I want to be in conversations with teachers and teacher educators and students and families where we could all listen closely, intentionally, and intently. Because if we listen for what's not being said, it will always show itself. But we have to listen in ways where we are understanding that people have voice and people have stories that we oftentimes refute in our pedagogical practices and engagements. It's Philip and Khalik who taught me that we need to refuse and reject the tendencies to ask young people to take off who they are when they walk into our classrooms as if they can. This is who they are. This is who I am. So how is it that you embrace the whole person walking into the classroom in ways where you understand difference and diversity as central to what it is that we're doing and talking about? And to do that, I really think we have to have deeper understandings of culturally relevant and culturally sustaining pedagogies. Culturally relevant pedagogy is not simply, let me play a song that I think my students like, and let me get them hooked, and now let me move on to the work I need to do. Culturally relevant pedagogy, like culturally sustaining pedagogy, is all about critical consciousness. It's all about justice. It's all about engaging people. And yes, we start where people are, as Geneva Smitherman would tell us, but we all move to a critical place because it's relevant to do so. It's because we are engaging in the work of critical consciousness. And how do we do that? And then finally, I'll end with this. I firmly believe that we must reframe our teaching and our research, our learning and our engagement as projects in humanization. And when I say projects in humanization, I'm not talking about just research, because research is important. But the engagements we have with people in community spaces is more important. There are things that Philip and Khalik have shared with me, and they ask me to this day, 10 years later or more, why aren't you writing about that? Because I can't. Because there are things that we talk about. There are things that you've shared with me that I feel as if no one else might really understand. And I can't have a side note, end note, footnote to everything that we've talked about. There are things that we learn from other people in our teaching practices that have to be valued and valuable to who we become in the world. And every story is not for research. Every experience is not to be cited or documented. And when we get to that understanding, then we're really building relationships with other people on the foundation of care, compassion, justice, equity, and humanization. And to do otherwise is to not engage in necessary disruptions. And I think that's what we have to do. Thanks.
Invite you to come up to this microphone to speak a question.
So first off, thank you for sharing those stories with us. That was really powerful. Thinking about being a teacher educator, my question is around how do we teach teachers to be thinking about how they can help their students break these narratives, and how do we also teach teachers who might be unaware of different inequities that are happening to think critically about those spaces before they enter a classroom?
What's your name?
Julia.
Julia. Very nice question. Thank you for that. Thank you. I think we have a lot of work to do. I also think we've done a lot of work. And so I was recently reminded that we need to start our responses by sharing aspects of the good work that we've done, and then where we still need to go. And so when we think about how do we prepare teacher education candidates to engage in this type of work, I think it's really important that we start with this belief that, at least for me, equity and justice are important. And if equity and justice are important, then I work toward those things. And I put those things not just in theory, but also in practice. So I walk into classrooms, I talk with teacher education candidates and work with them around some fundamental questions. Why are you here? What is it that you seek to do by becoming a teacher? What kind of harm, if any, has been enacted onto you in your K-12 schooling experiences or beyond? What kind of harm are you not trying to reiterate or sort of enact on other people when you become a teacher? Essentially, why are you here? Why are you here? And it's not to read the latest literature on culturally relevant. It has to be something that comes from a place of deep care and desire to teach. And if we are having those types of conversations in our programs, why are you here? Seems a simple question. But when I ask it of some of my teacher education candidates from before, it's a hard question to answer. It's because I like to read. It's because I love school. It's because I don't know what else to do, so I figure I should teach. Those aren't good enough answers. What about changing the world? What about changing the discourse and narrative around teaching and teacher education? What about saying, I'm not going to take a deficit perspective in working with students, and because I'm not, I want to model that for other people? What about, I want to work toward equity with other people, and one way to do that is by thinking about teaching as a critical, caring, and loving profession that is the most admirable profession anyone can be a part of. Until we have those types of conversations, I think we're going to, we had a lot of work to do. And so that's where I start. And I hope that by starting at that place, it helps to convince other people that teaching is serious work. I believe teaching is the hardest profession that you could have. We are working with different types of students. We're working by extension with families and community members. We're working with states because we have mandates. We're doing this work. And so I start there. And by starting there, teacher education candidates can then tell their literacy narratives and talk about their experiences in schools, and then really think deeply about, so why are you here? It's not because anyone can teach, because anyone can't. But why are you doing this work? And I think that's important to have that conversation.
Hello, and I'm also thankful for a very provocative presentation. What I'm thinking about is the examples you gave in terms of your encounters with these young people for the first time. And in part, you were able to develop relationships with them, partly because you already saw them as human, partly because you already imagined that they were more than the imagined narratives that you're working against, and they were not deficient. So when you combine the fact that often we're recruiting into teacher preparation programs individuals who would not have met the students and imagined them in the ways you imagine them, and may not have really developed narratives about why they came into teaching, and may in fact have the very reductionist narratives you're concerned about. What in our preparation would support us in cultivating those dispositions with students who are coming with those backgrounds and those reductionist narratives?
What's your name?
Carla.
Carla?
Yes.
Carla. Carla. You just dropped it and walked away. Carla. No, this is good. I actually want to listen to you, Carla, because I think you're on to something. You asked a provocative question. I think you might have an answer. All right, so I'm not going to put you on the spot, Carla. But you know, that's a reality. And I would say that I haven't met anyone who teaches from a critical and a conscious perspective who the people who come with reductionist perspectives are there. And even when I'm talking about equity and justice, I know they're there. And it's the way that we talk about equity and justice, and this might seem ridiculous, this might seem simple, but it's how we do the work, and it's about being honest about who we want in the conversation. And so if we want everyone in the conversation, I think there's an approach that has to be a bit inclusive to actually say, we're going to start where you are. And I need to know where you are. I need to understand what your perspectives are on this topic. I need to understand when you think about students of color from urban environments, what comes to mind? And I need to hear it all. If you have deficit perspectives, somehow I need to be able to enter into a classroom space, ask those questions, be willing to hear. You know, a student said, I never thought I was racist, but I am because these black students just can't learn. And this is how we started our class. And this was many years ago. And I could have done a number of things with that. And I still think I should have done something differently. But what I decided to do was to start with that dangerous, harmful narrative by not excluding this person from conversations, but what is it that we need to read in this classroom? What types of conversations have you not had? And so you are about to be placed in a certain type of school, but you've never even been in a certain type of school that you're about to be placed in, let alone you don't even know anything about the neighborhood. You haven't ever interacted with certain groups of people, and yet these are the perspectives that you have. We got to somehow have the conversations, however painful they might be, and we have to figure out what about our teacher education programs that have to better respond to these dangerous and harmful narratives that are reductionist in nature in reference to our kids. But at the same time, I can't point the finger only at teacher education programs because we are one but so many of the different careers and professions that people seek. So it's not exclusive to who we are and what we do, but it is something about what are we committed to? How are we working with our teacher ed candidates to have different types of conversations? But how can we do that if we don't have the faculty who are equipped to lead those conversations? So we can talk about recruiting teacher education candidates into our programs, but once they get there, who's teaching them? Who's teaching them? So on the one hand, it is about the students entering our programs And on the other hand, it really is also about the folks who are teaching them in classrooms who might also have reductionist deficit perspectives. And somehow, it's a larger conversation that goes way beyond the materials we use to teach. This is systemic. This is institutional. And we got to figure out a way to talk about who's at the table, who's not at the table, who's being represented, who's being misrepresented. We have to figure out a way to talk about who our faculty members are. And if we know they're not doing the work of critically conscious teaching and learning, why do we still have them here? Like, when you know, then you do better. But when you know and you still do wrong, and we still reward you, that's harming our kids, and that's harming their families. And by extension, I would say it's harming us. We've got to do something different. And, and Simona and I were talking earlier, one of the hard challenges of this work is understanding that these systems, patriarchy, white supremacy, racism, classism, sexism, segregation, they're expensive. And folks have actually put a lot of money into having these systems and maintaining them. And now we're talking about taking these systems apart. I want it to happen overnight, but I'm aware it's not going to. Because these systems they're rooted on a foundation of labor that has gone unacknowledged. So how do we do something differently? And I think we start with, in this case, teaching and saying, you want to be a teacher, but are you qualified? Why am I allowing you to enter into this program when you haven't had any types of experiences that would indicate that you want to be a great teacher? So everyone can't come in. Sorry. Try med school. And they would say everyone can't come in. And it's not to be exclusionary, but it is to say, med school, I don't know why I said that. But the point is, everyone wants to be a teacher, but everyone doesn't want to teach. And everyone thinks they can teach, and everyone can't. And yes, we have to get training. And yes, we have to be immersed, and we have to apprentice. And everyone can't teach. And I can't make excuses for people who can't teach and who shouldn't teach. When I have students, like some of the ones you've met today, saying, I'm about to graduate high school and I know I've been passed on, because they don't care about me. That's what we need to do. We need to figure out a way to interrupt and disrupt the system.
We have many, many questions from Twitter. And I'm just going to choose one because they're all really interesting. But wait, I'm looking for that one. How do we develop our sense about how to go about interrupting in the most efficacious ways? For example, with Derek, I imagine there are ways you could have invited yourself into his life that actually would have been counterproductive.
That actually would have been counterproductive?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yes. So what's the question again?
There must be ways that you could invite yourself into his life that would be counterproductive. How do you know what is the most efficacious way to go about interrupting with him?
Yeah, that's good. Thank you.
Twitter.
Thank you, Twitter. So let me go sort of quickly a roundabout way of answering this question. So as I've said already, I grew up in Charleston, South Carolina, and a father who did not graduate from middle school, but who told so many stories and was a great storyteller. And a mother who was an LPN, wanted to be a public school teacher, math, I believe. And I start there because there's something about who we are in the world based on the types of environments that cultivate us. And that environment cultivated me without even knowing it for what I think is to change parts of the world. But in changing parts of the world for people who should be at the table, like my father should have been at the table. And I think my mother should still be at the table, and my extended family members. And because they're not, it's the way that we have to really sit back and listen to these multiple stories that come from other people about their life, about their struggles, about their pains, about their wishes, their hopes, their dreams, and not just for themselves, because they never really thought about themselves. They thought about other people. They thought about me. They thought about my two brothers. They thought about other family members. They thought about changing the world in this segregated community. And if I believe that to be true, which I do, then how do we not impose on people what we think they should have, but we just take a moment and step back and ask? And that ask means that we have to listen. And I could say what I want for Derek still to this day, and I do. But we are at a point where we can have those interactions, and those interactions are based on the stories that are only Derek's stories, and the stories that have made him into the person that he is and will be. So how do we do this work by maybe inserting, but not really inserting ourselves? I think I already insert myself because I show up. And I don't need to talk about who I am in terms of, this is what you should do. We tell our stories by showing up, by being present, by taking the call, by actually having the will to actually arrive and to be there. And when I accidentally bumped into Derek, I can admit it wasn't accidental. It was, but it wasn't. And then I did it again. But you show up. And that's the way that we engage in this work. I want people to show up. And when our young people see us being there and present, then they can tell us the stories of who they are without me having to ask for the stories. I didn't ask for this story from Derek. It was an assignment, but he didn't have to share anything about his father or his family or his struggles or changing himself, but he did. And I just think that there's something about not countering our students' stories with our stories that have to actually take center stage. So I'm not going to do that. I have my stories. And we can have conversations about who we are because we do. And Philip and Khalik and Derek, for example, they really know who I am. But it didn't come about because I forced myself in or I invited myself into their literacy lives. They invited me, and they accepted me, and we had these conversations. And I don't know how to answer the question except for we got to show up. We got to take the call. When I'm at work, I talk about equity and justice all the time. And I have to also talk about equity and justice when I'm not at work. I don't take it off. And so when I show up for Derek, and then when I see Derek showing up for me, that's the kind of work that I'm after. And so that's how we don't counter each other and we still be present by being a part of people's lives.
I, too, want to thank you for your presentation and sharing your stories. I'm happy to see the work done at the levels that we see. A lot of times I see the work done at the high school level, the secondary level, but being an elementary educator, I could see the beginnings of some Derek's and some other of students at the earlier level. And so it'd be great to begin for maybe our newer teachers to see some of the work done with younger students. I am sometimes concerned that maybe it's thought that they're young, and so maybe I don't have to insert some of these thoughts into what I'm doing at the elementary level because these problems come up at an older age. So I would hope that some of our novice teachers or student teachers come in, or we could find a way for them to come in with a mindset in the elementary phase that we don't want a society or to create an atmosphere where we have a Derek or another, I forgot the first young lady's name, but I see this daily, and so our new students, our new teachers that are coming in, if they can come in, if we can find a way for them to come in knowing that these things affect our students even early on. It's not just they're elementary, so this has nothing to do with them, but it's important even at the beginning.
Yes.
I guess that was more of a comment than a question. But
And what's your name?
Cheryl.
Cheryl? Thank you for that. And that's an important comment. I think sometimes we think our kids don't know, you know, especially at the elementary level or pre-K. Like, we think they don't know. So we don't have to actually have these conversations. We don't have to sort of watch them with a critical, close eye. But we do, because they know. And if we understand that our kids know, then how do we actually take what they know and help shape what we need them to know and who we need them to become? So we have to start. We can't start in high school. So thank you for that comment, Cheryl.
I have many wonderful jobs. This is the most unpopular of them, which is to say that we're at time. So it's 6 o'clock. I want to just echo all of the thanks, the deep thanks that you know, everybody brought up in their questions to you for the ways in which you shared your thinking and also brought us into classrooms and allowed us to hear the brilliance of children and youth's voices. That is so powerful and so important, and I'm really grateful for that, and I think I know everyone else is as well. As I said, there are lots of questions on Twitter. I'm sure there are lots of questions left here. We'll get your paper, and you can respond to all of that, which will be fabulous. In a few weeks, we actually have the third seminar series coming up with Yolanda Seeley Ruiz, who is one of the scholars that Dr. Kinloch referenced, which is just fabulous that we can build you know, with great attention and care from what you've given us to our next step. So thank you so much, and thank you everybody for coming.
Thank you. Thank you.